The Eastern District Federal Courthouse rose like a fortress of polished marble and quiet authority, its columns catching the morning sun. Commuters rushed past on the sidewalks, indifferent to the histories written and unspoken within its walls. For most, the building symbolized order and procedure, where the nation's laws took form through the dry cadence of hearings and rulings. For Amara Castell, it was something else entirely, a stage she had spent 7 years preparing to step onto. She arrived with the anonymity she had cultivated like an art. Her clothes were simple but professional, dark slacks, a modest blouse, a jacket without embellishment. Nothing shouted for attention. Her hair pulled back in a functional knot, framed a face that seemed purposefully forgettable. The kind of face you would struggle to describe moments after seeing it. That was her intention. Invisibility had kept her alive. At the security checkpoint, she was just another civilian, placing her phone and keys into the plastic tray with practiced ease. A slim leather portfolio followed, the sort carried by paralegals and clerks. The officer monitoring the scanner gave it no more than a cursory glance before waving her through. The machine gave no alarm. Nothing about her presence demanded attention. That was how she wanted it. The corridors inside the courthouse carried the sounds of daily justice. Heels clicking against marble, clerks whispering to attorneys, the occasional burst of laughter quickly stifled under the weight of solemnity. Families sat in clusters on benches, their eyes nervous, as they waited for news that might alter their lives. Imara moved among them with quiet steps, pausing briefly at the building directory, though she already knew the way. Courtroom 307. She had memorized every hallway, every exit, every angle of approach. Preparation was the only kind of armor she trusted. United States versus Meridian Holdings. To the public, it was a high-profile corporate espionage case involving defense contracts and international data breaches. To Amara, it was cover, an event significant enough to draw media, observers, and government attention, yet ordinary enough to conceal the true reason she was there. She arrived early. 15 minutes before the session, the courtroom was already half full. Journalists with notepads compared schedules. Young law students whispered about precedents. Corporate representatives scrolled quickly through their phones before switching them off. Imara chose a seat in the back row. It gave her clear sight lines, the exits, the defense and prosecution tables, and most importantly, the judge's bench. Her notepad rested squarely on her lap, pen poised above it. To anyone glancing her way, she was another observer interested in the intricacies of law. But her notes would not mirror the day's transcript. Her eyes would not track the witnesses or lawyers so much as the man who would soon take the bench. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff's voice cut through the chatter. All rise. The room shifted as one. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pages stilled. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood entered with the bearing of a man used to absolute authority. His silver hair caught the overhead lights, his stride purposeful, his black robe falling into place with ritual precision. At 63, he looked every bit the model of judicial dignity, veteran, prosecutor, now one of the most respected judges in the federal system. His name often floated in Washington conversations about Supreme Court vacancies. "Be seated," he commanded, his baritone steady, carrying the authority of decades. The shuffle of chairs echoed as the courtroom obeyed. The proceedings began with formality, case numbers, appearances, procedural motions. The attorneys' voices rose and fell, alternating between dry recitation and sharp precision. Judge Blackwood listened with the practiced patience of a man who had seen every variety of courtroom theatrics. He interrupted sparingly, with a raised eyebrow or a curt question, enough to remind all present whose authority set the rhythm of the day. Imara's pen moved steadily across the page. She did not record arguments or objections. Instead, she noted the tilt of the judge's head when certain phrases were spoken, the fraction of a second before his gavel fell, the way his fingers tapped once against the bench when impatient. She was not collecting legal notes. She was documenting a man. To the others, she was invisible. To herself, she was a ghost reclaiming shape. 7 years earlier, Her sister's name had been erased, not by accident, but by design. Operation Obsidian Path had been struck from the record, its casualties reduced to numbers on redacted files. Her sister had been one of them, a soldier who had given her life only to have the truth of her sacrifice buried beneath classified directives. Since that day, Imara had lived as if she too were erased, building a new identity, moving silently, waiting. Now in this room, she was finally within reach of the man who had given the order that condemned her sister and her unit. He wore the robe of justice, but Imara had not forgotten the uniform he once wore, nor the decisions that had betrayed those he led. The prosecution called its first witness, a nervous man in wire-rimmed glasses who spoke at length about breaches and classified servers. To most, it was technical jargon. To Imara, it was noise. What mattered was the way Blackwood leaned forward when certain details were mentioned, the narrowing of his eyes when national security came into the discussion. She wrote down each reaction with precision. Time passed. Testimony layered on testimony. The defense pressed, the prosecution objected, the judge ruled. A rhythm developed, familiar to the courtroom regulars. To them, it was another day in litigation. To Imara, it was the slow tightening of a net she had been weaving for years. At noon, Judge Blackwood announced a recess. The attorneys gathered their files. Journalists stretched stiff backs. Observers filed out in murmurs of anticipation for the afternoon session. Imara remained still for a moment longer, her pen finally pausing. Then she closed her notepad, slid it into her portfolio, and rose with the same unremarkable efficiency that had marked her entrance. She walked the marble corridors to the cafeteria, blending again into the crowd. A salad and water. Nothing indulgent, nothing memorable. She ate in silence, reviewing her morning notes. Every gesture, every shift in Blackwood's expression, captured and annotated. Patterns were forming, confirmation of what she already knew. A law clerk at a nearby table glanced at her, curiosity flickering, then quickly looked away when her calm, steady gaze met his. It was not a glare, not even particularly intense, but something in it unsettled him. A reminder that some presences, however quiet, were not meant to be studied too closely. When the recess ended, she returned to Courtroom 307. The same seat, the same angle of her notepad, the same unbroken watch. She had waited 7 years for this moment, and she could wait a few hours more. Because ghosts did not hurry. Ghosts haunted patiently. The afternoon session opened with a change in the air that was hard to name. The same faces returned to their seats. The same microphones waited on the same desks, yet something felt tighter, like a wire pulled one notch further than before. Imara took the same spot in the back row and set her notepad at the exact angle she preferred. Habit calmed the body. Precision kept the mind clear. Judge Blackwood entered with the same purposeful stride, robe settling as he took a seat. His expression gave nothing away. Imara watched the tiny details anyway. The set of his jaw, the way he adjusted the stack of filings so their corners aligned. People revealed themselves in how they handled order. "Counsel, proceed," he said. Assistant United States Attorney Pascal Valmont rose, all clipped courtesy and clean lines. The government calls Dr. Warren Schaefer. A thin man in wire-rimmed glasses made his way to the stand. Right hand raised, oath administered. He sat with the careful posture of someone who knew that facts could be weapons if handled poorly. "Dr. Schaefer," Valmont began, "please state your position at Meridian Holdings." "I am the Chief Data Security Officer." "And Meridian's work includes contracts with the Department of Defense." "Yes." "For the record, please describe the nature of those systems." Schaefer used phrases that sounded dense enough to impress the gallery and specific enough to assure the judge. Encrypted satellite communication standards, compartmented access, layered authentication. For 40 minutes, Valmont walked him through the breach that had lit the case. Unauthorized entry, lateral movement, quiet exfiltration of files. He kept the questions tidy. The witness kept his language clinical. Imara recorded none of it. She noted when Blackwood leaned forward. She noted when he did not. She wrote down the time he interrupted to ask which agencies had been notified. She marked the pause that followed Schaefer's mention of overseas servers. A good judge could hide his leanings. A perfect judge could not hide them from a trained observer. When Valmont finished, the courtroom shifted again. Zara Abernathy stood for the defense, calm and steady, with the kind of voice that made jurors want to listen before they decided whether to agree. "Dr. Schaefer," she said, "before Meridian, you worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency, correct?" Valmont was on his feet. Objection. Relevance. Abernathy did not look at him. "Your Honor, the government's theory requires proof of access to very specific classified material. The witness's previous role speaks to overlap, chain of custody, and who else might have touched what Meridian now claims was stolen." Blackwood considered her. His gaze slid briefly to the witness, then back. "I will allow a limited line of questioning. Keep it to access and process." "Yes, Your Honor." Imara's pen moved faster. A line under limited. A dot next to access. A small X next to considered. She did not know when she had started using that code. She only knew it worked. "Dr. Schaefer," Abernathy resumed, "while at DIA, did you have knowledge of or involvement with an operation known as Obsidian Path?" The word entered the room like a draft under a locked door. You could feel it if you knew what cold air meant. Valmont snapped up. "Objection." "Overruled is phrased," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost a little warmth. "Counselor, this is the last question along this line." Schaefer swallowed. "I had knowledge of it. Did your knowledge overlap with Meridian's later contracts?" "Not formally." "Informally." He hesitated. "I cannot discuss that in an open session." Valmont protested again. Blackwood sustained, struck the last response, instructed the jury to disregard. The real conversation had already landed. Imara wrote only 4 characters in the margin. OP. She circled it once. A memory pressed against the edges of her calm. Heat. Sand and teeth. Rotor noise in the distance that never grew louder. A voice through static. The cadence so familiar it lived in her bones. Pargrin 2 to command. Taking fire. Need extraction. Coordinates transmitted. Do you copy? The reply had never come. Or rather, a reply had come, just not the one a soldier expects. Imara lowered her eyes and breathed once, slow enough that no one would notice the reset. The afternoon moved into procedures. The prosecution sought to introduce forensic images pulled from the defendant's drives. Defense argued chain of custody. Everyone performed the dance of rules. Blackwood's rulings favored the government more often than not. He was careful about it. He was also consistent. When the next witness took the stand, a former security consultant to Meridian named Reeves, the tone changed again. He adjusted his tie 3 times before the clerk finished the oath. "Mr. Reeves," Abernathy said, "you supported Meridian's overseas facilities, including what the company called its Azerbaijan redundancies, correct?" "Among others," he replied. Valmont objected. "Classified sites, Your Honor." "The question is about scope," Abernathy said, "not operations." "I will allow scope only," Blackwood said. His eyes had narrowed a fraction. A fraction was enough. "Were you present at the Baku site during the period of the alleged breach?" Abernathy asked. Reeves hesitated. He looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then back to his hands. "Yes." "And did you participate in meetings where security protocols at that site were discussed?" "Yes." "Were those protocols compromised?" "We believe so." Abernathy took one step closer. "Mr. Reeves, were you aware of or present for any activity connected to a historical DIA program referred to as Obsidian Path?" The objections came fast. Blackwood's gavel fell harder than before. "Counselor, enough. That term is not relevant to this proceeding and veers into classified territory. The last question is stricken." For most of the room, the moment looked like a line crossed and then reset. For Imara, it was evidence. The judge did not simply dislike the area of inquiry. He feared it. Fear had a posture. She wrote, "Left shoulder stiffens when OP referenced 3 taps of index finger. Avoids eye contact with defense." The note was surgical, clinical. It steadied her. A young court officer opened the side door, and two men entered without sound. Dark suits, regulation haircuts, the stillness of people trained to move only when required. They took positions along the back wall, not far from where Amara sat. Their eyes scanned the room and kept returning to the bench. Not courthouse security. Federal. Containment, Amara thought. She marked their arrival time and the moment Blackwood noticed them. His chin lifted a centimeter. He did not look back again. He did not need to. He knew who had entered his courtroom. The rest of the gallery felt the tension and tried to name it with whispers. Journalists wrote faster. Law students leaned in. The case had grown teeth. Amara kept writing. She did not look at the men in suits. She already knew what they were for. The defense pressed again. Your Honor, the government cannot use national security as both sword and shield, Abernathy said. They cannot point to overseas servers and then forbid inquiry into the same. We are entitled to context. Ms. Abernathy, Blackwood said, patience thinning, I have ruled on this. You have what you need to challenge the forensic evidence. You do not have leave to drag classified programs into this courtroom. With respect, Your Honor, the government placed those programs here when it built its case. Move on or conclude your cross. Abernathy studied him for half a beat, then nodded once. She pivoted to another topic and finished her questions with the restraint of someone saving her best material for appeal. Amara's pen did not rest. She mapped the courtroom in notes. Agent positions. Defense strategy. Prosecution tells. She was building a picture that would make sense later. It always did when you let the data sit long enough. At 3:15, the judge called a short recess. 15 minutes, he said. When we return, we will proceed directly to the digital exhibits. Counsel, be ready. People stood, stretched, started toward the aisles. A few journalists made for the door to file quick updates. The men in suits did not move. They were not here for the news cycle. Amara remained seated. She copied 2 lines from earlier in the margin and drew a box around them. Obsidian path. Baku. The words carried weight that most in the room would never feel. For Amara, they were not just a subject line in a classified memo. They were a place and a day. A runway pitted with scorch marks. A radio channel that went quiet mid-sentence. The smell of burned metal that does not wash out of a uniform no matter how many times you try. Her sister had led Pargrin unit into that compound with a clean objective and a tight window. Identify the pipeline diverting weapons from Allied caches to the very groups targeting those allies. Secure proof. Extract. A simple plan. If the people responsible for oversight had not decided that their own survival mattered more than the truth. Amara had listened in real time from a liaison office thousands of miles away, pinned between duty and impotence. She could still hear Era's voice in the last minute of the last transmission. Calm even then. Not brave for show, just the kind of steady that keeps others alive. Pargrin 2 to command. Package confirmed. Extraction site compromised. Adjusting route. Request immediate air. Copy. Silence had followed. Then a single order from a voice that, until that day, Amara had been trained to trust. Authorization acknowledged. New coordinates received. Strike approved. There are silences you learn to live with. There are also silences you refuse to accept. Amara had spent 7 years choosing the second. The bailiff's call ended the recess. People returned. Chairs scraped. The judge took the bench again, the robe's hem brushing wood. He looked the same. He was not the same. This portion of the proceeding will involve exhibits that include sensitive material, he announced. If there are further disruptions, I will consider clearing the gallery. A warning for the room. A message for the defense. A signal for the men in suits. Amara set her pen to the page. A few more moves, and the board would look like she had always known it would. She felt the familiar patience settle in her chest. The urge to act lives close to the urge to finish. She had learned to separate them. On the screen at the front of the courtroom, the first digital image appeared. File trees. Timestamps. Hash values. The kind of proof that looks dull until a jury understands what it means. Valmont narrated, precise and careful, an accountant reconciling a ledger of crimes. Imara watched Blackwood, not the screen. His gaze tracked the exhibit, then drifted to the back wall, then returned. His jaw tightened again at the mention of a server in Baku. It loosened when Valmont moved past it. Abernathy's pen stilled for 2 beats there and then resumed. The men in suits watched the judge more than the lawyers. The picture was complete enough to live on its own. It needed one more piece to change from picture to confession. Imara knew the word that would do it. She had carried it like a flame no one else could see. Not yet, she told herself. One more turn of the wire. One more notch. Some ghosts do not slam doors. They open them and wait. The afternoon pressed on. The clock at the back of a courtroom ticked toward 4. The judge's patience thinned, visible as paper. Valmont signaled that he was nearly done. Abernathy prepared to object one more time, not to win, but to mark the record. Imara closed her eyes for half a second, long enough to see Era's face as it had been in the photo on Amara's bookshelf. Desert light. Laugh lines earned honestly. A promise made over an empty casket. Justice is not a gesture. It is a schedule you keep. She opened her eyes and lifted her pen again. The day would end soon. The moment she had built would not. It would carry into tomorrow if it had to. She could wait. She had already proved that she could. When the gavel finally struck to announce another brief recess, a murmur ran the length of the room. People stood. The men in suits moved a step forward for the first time all day. Imara remained in her seat, calm and upright, the picture of a citizen taking notes in public court. She wrote one last line, small and neat, at the bottom of the page. Tomorrow, if not today. The morning after felt different before the courthouse even opened. Reporters had gathered on the steps earlier than usual, their chatter bouncing off marble columns as camera crews jockeyed for position. A whisper of secrecy attracts more attention than any official press release, and yesterday's sudden appearance of men in suits had given the case a new gravity. Imara arrived as she always did, on time, unnoticed. She slipped through the metal detector, portfolio under her arm, nodding politely to the officer who had waved her through the day before. Her rhythm had not changed. Routine was camouflage. She crossed the echoing atrium, climbed 2 flights, and entered courtroom 307 with steady steps. The gallery buzzed with a different energy. Law students sat straighter, pens poised as if history might take dictation. Journalists whispered about sealed exhibits, citing unnamed sources. Even the defense and prosecution tables seemed sharper at the edges, their files stacked like barricades. Imara took her usual seat at the back, set her notepad in place, and drew one clean line across the top of the page. A date, a case number, space for what mattered. All rise. Judge Blackwood entered with the same gait as yesterday, but Imara caught the slight heaviness in his shoulders. Authority weighed more when it was borrowed from secrets you couldn't acknowledge. He adjusted his robe at the bench, gaze sweeping over the room in measured silence. "Be seated," he said. The attorneys moved quickly. Valmont, representing the government, wasted no time signaling the importance of what was to come. "Your Honor, we are prepared to introduce Exhibit 42B. The defense has been provided copies under protective order." Blackwood's expression was neutral, but his fingers tapped once against the bench. "Proceed." The lights dimmed. A projection screen lowered. Rows of digital images blinked into view, file paths, encrypted logs, traces of intrusion across Meridian servers. To most, it looked like computer science homework. To a jury, properly explained, it was the skeleton of conspiracy. Valmont narrated. This sequence shows the transfer of classified data through foreign servers. Note the repeated handoff points, including Baku. The word Baku slid into the room like a drop of ink in clear water. Imara felt the change ripple outward. Blackwood's jaw tightened. One of the men in suits at the back shifted his stance by an inch. Abernathy, the defense attorney, underlined something in her notes and raised her head slowly, as if deciding whether to use it now or save it. Imara wrote, Baku trigger. Valmont continued, his voice steady, his pacing rehearsed. He was building a ladder for the jury, each rung a simple fact, each fact leading to a conclusion they could not avoid. But the careful rhythm faltered when Abernathy rose to cross-examine. Mr. Valmont, she said smoothly, your case relies heavily on the claim that these transfers point directly to my client. But your own logs show the involvement of overseas sites tied to programs the government has not fully disclosed. Isn't that correct? Objection, Valmont snapped. Counsel is mischaracterizing the evidence. Overruled in part, Blackwood said after a pause. His voice had an edge now. The witness may answer within the scope of the exhibits. Abernathy smiled faintly. Then let's be precise. These transfers involve servers in Baku. Those servers have a history, do they not? The witness hesitated. He knew the rules. He also knew which rules mattered more. They were leased under classified agreements. Agreements connected to a defense intelligence program. Valmont was on his feet again, but Abernathy pressed forward. Her tone sharpened. A program once referred to as Obsidian Path. The word landed like glass shattering in a silent hall. The gallery froze. Pens hovered in midair. Even the journalists stopped typing. The sound itself seemed to echo long after she said it, reverberating off marble and oak. Obsidian Path. Blackwood's gavel struck. Counsel enough. His voice was louder than the wood. The last question is stricken. The jury will disregard. But the jury was human. Humans do not unhear what rings like a gunshot in a quiet room. The men in suits at the back both shifted now, exchanging a brief glance. Their presence was no longer passive. Containment had become enforcement. Imara's pen moved swiftly. She underlined the words Obsidian Path 3 times. She noted Blackwood's reaction, voice elevated. Right hand clenched around the gavel longer than necessary. Chin raised to project control, but not confidence. Abernathy lowered her voice, but not her eyes. Your Honor, the government cannot invoke national security to shield context essential to my client's defense. If these servers were compromised under programs unrelated to him, the jury deserves to know. The jury will know only what is relevant, Blackwood said firmly. His tone had returned to control, but the earlier fracture was still visible to those who watched closely. Move on. The courtroom exhaled as if it had been holding breath. But the silence left behind was not the same silence as before. It was fractured. Everyone in that room, now, carried a word they were not supposed to carry. Imara let the sound of it repeat in her mind. Obsidian Path. Spoken aloud at last, after 7 years of existing only in whispers and memory. She felt no satisfaction, not yet. Only confirmation. The truth had teeth. The session continued, but the rhythm was broken. Witnesses stumbled over answers. Jurors exchanged sidelong looks. The defense pressed less aggressively, satisfied with the fissure they had opened. The prosecution worked harder to plaster over it, their questions growing sharper, their tone defensive. Imara watched Blackwood. He gave more objections to the defense than the prosecution, but each ruling seemed to cost him a fraction of composure. She saw the way his eyes flicked, just once, toward the men in suits. She saw the way he ended recesses a few minutes earlier than scheduled. Small deviations, but deviations nonetheless. When the afternoon adjournment came, the gallery spilled into the hallways, buzzing with speculation. What's Obsidian Path? Whispered one journalist. Sounds like a CIA thing, guessed another. Law students argued in knots of nervous excitement. Imara kept her silence, walking among them without answering, without reacting. She reached the cafeteria again, ordered black coffee, and sat alone at a corner table. From her portfolio, she pulled the notepad, scanning the lines she had written that morning. One phrase stood out, boxed in neat ink, the word that shatters silence. She traced the letters with her fingertip. Abernathy had been reckless, perhaps, or strategic. Either way, the word was in play now, and the walls could not contain it. Memory uncoiled again, uninvited. The final radio call, Era's voice steady under fire. The silence that followed. The official letters, sanitized and vague. The redacted files stamped with the black insignia of classification. For years, Obsidian Path had been nothing more than a locked door. Today, someone had cracked it open. Imara closed the notebook. She sipped the bitter coffee, her pulse steady despite the storm around her. The courtroom would reconvene in less than an hour. The defense would decide whether to press again or retreat. The government would scramble to reinforce the frame of its case. And Judge Blackwood would try to pretend that nothing had happened, though everyone had seen him flinch. She let the hum of conversation wash over her. No one looked at her twice. No one asked her opinion. That was her shield. She was invisible, and invisibility was power. By the time she returned to the courtroom, the journalists had already filed stories hinting at mysterious classified programs. Analysts on live feeds speculated in vague terms, careful not to say too much. The word was out. It could not be taken back. Imara resumed her seat. She placed her pen on the page. She was ready for the next move. Ghosts do not need to speak loudly. Sometimes they only need one word. And today, that word had been spoken. By the third day of hearings, the courthouse no longer felt like neutral ground. The chatter outside was different, urgent, laced with the electricity of discovery. Headlines spoke of classified programs and unanswered questions. Officials avoided cameras. And inside Courtroom 307, the air was taut, as if every person present sensed that the trial was no longer about corporate espionage alone. Imara slipped in quietly, the way she always did, but she could feel the shift. Two new men in suits stood near the back, broader in the shoulders, their eyes fixed on the gallery. A woman in a government-issue skirt suit occupied a bench close to the jury, her posture military even as she pretended to review a notebook. Reinforcements. Blackwood's reinforcements. The bailiff called the session to order. All rise. Blackwood entered briskly, robe swinging. His composure looked intact, but Imara saw what others did not. His jaw was set too firmly. His gaze lingered too long on the jury box, as if trying to reclaim ground already lost. She recorded the tells with the same precision she had the day before. The prosecution opened with a flurry of motions, clearly designed to smother the previous day's eruption. "Your Honor," Valmont said, voice clipped, "the government requests that all future references to classified agreements be conducted in sealed chambers, not before the jury." Abernathy rose slowly, measured in her timing. And yet the defense cannot simply unhear what was already confirmed. Baku, Obsidian Path. These are not inventions. They are part of the chain of custody my client is accused of breaching. Objection, Valmont shot back. Sustained, Blackwood said quickly. Counsel tread carefully. Abernathy didn't press. She didn't need to. The seed had already sprouted. Every time she allowed the silence to linger, the jury filled it with curiosity. Every time she spoke the name Obsidian Path, even if stricken from the record, it echoed. The government called another witness, this time an analyst with cropped hair and an expression rehearsed into neutrality. But under Abernathy's cross-examination, even he wavered. She needled carefully. "Were you aware of other operations using similar channels?" I cannot confirm that in open court," the analyst stammered. A juror scribbled something furiously on his pad. Another leaned forward, elbows on knees. Imara smiled faintly behind her neutral expression. The walls Blackwood had built around the truth were beginning to crumble. At recess, the gallery broke into a low storm of murmurs. Reporters rushed to the payphones in the lobby and clutched their press badges like shields. Students compared frantic notes. Blackwood left the bench swiftly, his black robe billowing as though he might outrun what was closing in. Imara stayed behind, unmoving. She did not need to rush. She was here to observe the cracks widening, not to force them. Still, when the gallery emptied, she let her gaze rest squarely on the bench where Blackwood had sat. She pictured him there, head bent as classified orders slid across his desk 7 years ago. Orders that had erased her sister. She waited until the last stragglers left, then stood and walked the corridor slowly, her footsteps steady against the marble. Two of the new men in suits clocked her as she passed. Their gazes lingered for half a second too long, then shifted away. They didn't recognize her, not really. They only recognized the possibility that she didn't belong. She let them wonder. The cafeteria was crowded. She chose a corner seat again, coffee cooling as she studied her notes. She boxed one line. Containment is failing. She underlined it twice. Memory crept in while she wrote. The night before her sister's deployment, Era had called her from the barracks. "If something happens, make sure it means something," Era had said. Her voice strong but weighted with the knowledge of what they were being asked to do. That was the promise Imara carried now. When the session resumed, Blackwood's tone was clipped, his rulings delivered with less patience. He overruled the defense often, cut off objections quickly, leaned heavily on procedure. But Imara saw the truth. These were not the moves of a man in control. They were the moves of a man retreating, narrowing the corridors, trying to keep the walls from caving in. Abernathy, shrewd as ever, adapted. She asked shorter questions. She let witnesses reveal their discomfort with silence. She spoke the name Obsidian Path sparingly now, knowing each mention carried greater weight precisely because it had been forbidden. The men in suits shifted again, restless at the back of the room. Imara sensed the pressure rising. Blackwood's gavel fell harder with each objection. He wanted order, but order was slipping. As the afternoon waned, the prosecution attempted to redirect. Valmont leaned heavily on the corporate aspects, trade secrets, contracts, spreadsheets that meant nothing compared to the names still ringing in everyone's minds. The jury tried to listen, but Imara saw their eyes glaze. The trial had been recast. By the time Blackwood called the day's adjournment, the weight of it was unmistakable. His robe seemed heavier. His voice, when he dismissed the jury, cracked just slightly. No one else might have heard it. Imara did. "All rise," the bailiff commanded again. The gallery stood. Blackwood swept out, but his stride was clipped, his movements sharper, as though urgency pressed at his back. Imara did not move until the last echoes of his footsteps had faded. She wrote one more line in her notepad. "He knows the walls are closing in." When she finally stepped out into the cooling dusk, the courthouse steps were alive with questions shouted by reporters. Microphones thrust at passing attorneys, cameras flashing. Imara slipped through the chaos, invisible once more, her mind steady. The cracks were spreading. The walls were closing in. And ghosts, she reminded herself, were very patient. The courthouse was restless long before the jury filed back into their seats. The buzz from the press had reached a fever pitch. Overnight, networks ran speculative pieces with blurred documents and retired officials dodging questions. Obsidian Path had become more than a courtroom slip. It was a story the government could not contain. Imara felt it as she moved through security. The guards were tighter, more deliberate. The men in suits scanned the gallery harder, trying to measure who belonged. Even Blackwood's bailiff carried himself differently, like a man tasked with keeping a lid on something ready to boil over. She entered courtroom 307 and took her usual seat. A ritual now. A role. The invisible witness. Her notepad lay open, the last line from yesterday stark in its simplicity. "He knows the walls are closing in." All rise. Blackwood emerged. His robe hung as heavily as ever, but his face was drawn, pale beneath the lights. Authority no longer clung to him. It had to be forced, propped up by the formality of the gavel in his hand. "Be seated." The proceedings began. Valmont pressed his case, his voice clipped, his gestures sharp. He rattled through witness testimony and corporate ledgers, but the jury was elsewhere. Their eyes flickered toward the defense table, toward Abernathy, toward the word that had become the silent center of gravity. Obsidian Path. They did not say it, but it was there. Always there. Abernathy knew it too. She played her role with precision, raising objections with a calm tone, cross-examining witnesses just long enough to remind everyone of what was being avoided. She didn't need to win outright. She only needed to show that the government was hiding more than it was revealing. Imara's pen moved steadily. Her gaze never left Blackwood. He tried to appear unmoved, but his rulings betrayed him. Each time Abernathy neared the edges of forbidden territory, he tightened, cutting her short. Too quickly. Too often. A judge protecting process might lean on decorum, but Blackwood was protecting something larger, something personal. At mid-morning, Abernathy asked a simple question of a government analyst. Were there programs other than the defendant's company operating through Baku? The courtroom froze. The analyst hesitated, lips parting. For a heartbeat too long, the silence said everything. Objection. Valmont barked. Sustained, Blackwood snapped, his voice sharper than it should have been. He slammed the gavel once, twice, harder than necessary. The jury will disregard. But they wouldn't. They couldn't. Imara saw it in their faces. Curiosity had become certainty. The government was hiding something, and Blackwood was in the middle of it. The rest of the day dragged. Witnesses stumbled. Motions piled up. Blackwood grew harsher, impatient. By the time he called the recess, the gallery was a hive of murmurs again. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the jurors left the box with furrowed brows, exchanging glances they didn't bother to hide. Imara remained seated. She didn't follow the crowd. Instead, she waited, hands folded neatly over her notes, until the room had thinned to silence. Blackwood, gathering his papers at the bench, finally noticed her stillness. Their eyes met for the first time. For 7 years, she had waited for this. She rose slowly, stepping into the aisle. No rush, no drama, just a quiet inevitability. The men in suits shifted near the door, but she raised one hand slightly, a command more than a gesture. They froze, uncertain. Blackwood's expression flickered. Recognition, and then fear. Pargrin, Imara said, her voice clear in the empty room. The word landed heavier than the gavel. Blackwood's breath caught. His eyes darted toward the suits, then back to her. The mask was gone. You, his voice cracked. He swallowed, tried again. You're supposed to be. Gone, she finished. Forgotten? That was the idea, wasn't it? Erase us. Erase her. Blackwood's knuckles whitened around his papers. This is not the place. This is exactly the place. Imara stepped closer, her portfolio under her arm like a weapon sharper than any blade. You buried them under that word. Pargrin. Classified it into silence. You thought it would never see daylight. The men in suits moved, finally, but too late. Imara slid a sealed envelope onto the clerk's desk, her motions calm, deliberate. That's the record, she said. Every order, every signature, every omission. Copies already with oversight committees. And with the press. Blackwood's face drained of color. The gavel in his hand trembled. For the first time in years, the man who had orchestrated silence had no words. Imara didn't wait for his reply. She turned, walking past the suits as if they weren't there. None dared stop her. Ghosts were hard to contain once they chose to speak. The fallout came swiftly. Within days, hearings moved from courtrooms to the halls of Congress. The Pentagon issued statements layered in careful vagueness, each one unraveling as documents leaked. Families of the Pargrin unit, once told their loved ones had died in unremarkable accidents, now learned the truth. They had been sacrificed under orders that were never meant to see review. Blackwood resigned under the thin veil of health concerns. The media tore through his record, unearthing patterns of rulings that favored silence over disclosure. He became a name spoken with bitterness, a symbol of how justice could be bent. And Imara? For weeks, she kept to the shadows, watching the tide shift. The recognition she had avoided for so long now sought her out. Invitations to speak, requests for interviews, formal apologies delivered in embossed envelopes. She declined them all, but one invitation she accepted. A ceremony, quiet but dignified, held at Arlington. A new granite marker, carved at last with the names of the Pargrin unit. Among them, Captain Araceli Castell. Imara stood at the back, as always. She did not approach the podium. She did not speak when others wept or offered words of remembrance. She simply stood, hands clasped, the chill November air biting her skin. When the flag was folded and the final salute fired, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not closure, but a beginning. Later, as the crowd dispersed, a general she half recognized approached. His voice was low. "There are other files, other shadows, if you want to help." Imara looked past him toward the rows of headstones. The silence, there was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of honor. She nodded once. "I'm listening." The general handed her a card, then left her alone. Imara slipped it into her coat pocket, her eyes returning to the granite marker. Era's name, carved in stone at last. Justice delayed. Justice delivered. But justice, she knew, was not finished. Not yet.